The first story I wanted to cover is somewhat of an interesting one. It's Andrew Tate, the man that supposedly broke out of the Matrix. Maybe he did. I don't know. We'll see this video. One of the interesting things about folks like this is that there's always some critique of the system as a whole, but then the solutions that are provided are always within the framework of that system itself. We've talked about in the past, the role of the compatible left, about the role of radical recuperators, a concept that Professor Gabriel Rockhill has developed. We've talked to him plenty of times on the show about this concept. And we tend to associate it to the objects that were tied to the critique when the concept was developed, which is primarily Western Marxism. But I think this applies to a wide variety of other areas where the bourgeoisie provides for us certain figures, certain movements that get dissenting attitudes and energies that exist in the masses and locate them there and keep them in a position that is substantially not actually anti-establishment, substantially not anti the capitalist imperialist system. Because to do that, you have to be for something. You can't just have this pure empty negativity. The negative always carries with it a positive content. And more often than not, these red pill critics, the positive content that's tied to their negative is something that continues to reinforce the established order. But it's still important to engage with it, just like it is important to engage with Western Marxism and other more advanced and coherent forms of radical recuperators, as I've done in that book that you see back there, The Purity, Fetish, and the Crisis of Western Marxism, as in other areas as well. So let's listen to, I guess, Comrade Kate now. It's Comrade Tate describe wage slavery, and then let's analyze it for a little bit.
You're to say to me right now, Andrew, you can have slaves. I'd say, okay. You have to house them. You have to feed them. You have to give them medical care to make sure they stay alive. And then you have to somehow get them to work hard at the best of their ability, even though they're not motivated because they're slaves. That sounds very difficult. It sounds expensive. It sounds like a lot of work. It's much easier to just pay these people a very low wage in which they can barely afford their own house, barely afford their own food. So they're still enslaved for a little bit of money, barely afford their own medical care, but they still have to do everything I say. Wage slavery has replaced traditional slavery because it's easier for the elites to keep you a wagee than it is to make you a slave. Let's make sure the money inflates. Let's make sure everyone's poor. This is why we always talk about making money to escape the matrix. Make sure everybody's broke, and then we'll just make them wagees, because a wagee is just a slave of another kind. We haven't got to worry about actually dealing with their health care, actually giving them a house. We can just give them these few pennies of money we print, and they're still stuck. If you were to say to me right now, Andrew, you can have slaves.
So that's I think that's absolutely true. It was how it was often talked about, even in the U.S. after we were able to overcome chattel slavery. A lot of the abolitionist critics of chattel slavery turned their attention to wage slavery. You look at the writings of Frederick Douglass following the abolition of slavery, and he talks about, what are we getting ourselves into? Is it really substantially better than chattel slavery? And I think there's many ways in which it is substantially better than chattel slavery. I don't want to denigrate the horrendous conditions of chattel slavery, specifically in the ways that it was practiced in the Americas and the racialized forms that it took. It's a qualitative leap forward into wage slavery, but it's still a form of slavery. You're still radically disconnected from any sense of human autonomy over your work and what you do in order to survive. So critiques of capitalism as a system that produces this form of wage slavery that might come into the historical scene proclaiming all of these democratic values at the level of politics and civil society, but that at the economic level it sustains this aristocratic hierarchical structure, are very old. They're not, Tate didn't invent these, and Marxism itself didn't invent these. Critiques of wage slavery as a form of slavery were already found in various forms in the utopian socialist. They're also found in the earliest parts of the tradition of American socialism, which is rooted in many ways in some of the democratic ideals of the Declaration of Independence, and specifically Jefferson's thought. You had in the mid to late 20s a whole outburst of various thinkers, from Cornelius Blatchley, Langdon Bilsby, William McClure, and many others that often had some form of interaction with the utopian communities that we had here in the US, and were left very much dissatisfied. They understood that the idea of creating an alternative world within the existing system, and of doing it out of on the material basis of a bourgeois philanthropy, and basing a form of communism or socialism on the harmonization of classes, class antagonisms, rather than on the basis of exploiting these contradictions and these class antagonisms, so that the pregnant character of the system with contradictions that can develop into a new system can naturally unfold. They were seeing the futility of utopian socialism, and some of them began to attempt to study the capitalist system systematically, see how this exploitation and oppression and polarization of wealth, where a small group of people get immensely rich while the vast majority stay in dire poverty, how that's a structural, systematic component of the capitalist system. And they attempt to develop, already in the 1820s to 1830s, something that we would call later on, when Marxism comes around, scientific socialism. Now, they don't complete the project. The capitalism that they're analyzing, specifically in the US, is very embryonic. But nonetheless, there's that attempt to provide a scientific understanding of the system, and a scientific understanding of how it is that on the basis of the system's own contradictions, a new, more egalitarian, actually democratic, actually freeing order, often called communism, socialism, communalism, etc., can already come about. So the understanding of capitalist work as wage slavery was already found in those traditions, those first early traditions of American socialism, again, that saw socialism as a practical and logical extension of the democratic ideals of the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, etc., etc. You also have, interestingly enough, critiques of wage slavery from more reactionary sectors of society, whether it's the slave-holding planters in the South who use the despotic nature of wage slavery in the North to say that the slavery that they that they have in the South isn't that bad. And to do that, they were forced to attenuate and say some true things about the horrendous conditions of wage slavery in the North, while always leaving a blank eye and making the slavery that they were participating in, that they were profiting from, seem more rosy than it actually was. I think any fair assessment will find that more often than not, the condition, of course, of the chattel slave was much worse than of the wage slave, horrible though the wage slave's conditions might have been. So you have various angles through which this critique of wage slave is waged. And of course, this is just a small, short clip from Andrew Tate. If we see the larger thing, it might fit within a more progressive socialistic tradition. It might fit within the more conservative tradition. I doubt that it fits into either. I think this follows a trend that we've seen in American society for quite a while, which is an acknowledgement that 9-to-5 jobs are horrendous, that you're not actually free when you're working a wage job, that you're submitting your will in the form of the exertion of your labor power to another entity, to another human being who decides what you work on, how you work, how long you work, what's done with the product of your labor, who it's sold to, who it's not sold to, how much it's sold for, et cetera, et cetera. But instead of saying, the solution to this is working people coming together, recognizing the historical and transient character of the system that creates these conditions, and recognizing how it is within their power as a class, especially unifying with other popular classes as well, to overthrow the system and create a qualitatively better one, where working people are in power and we actually have what the American dream promised, a government of, by, and for the people. Instead of taking it to that logical socialist conclusion, they usually provide a similar utopian exit, like don't take the 9-to-5 route, don't go to university, don't do this, don't do whatever the system asks you, just learn how to be financially literate, learn how to scheme your way into being rich so that you can have this freedom. And that's obviously not a solution. That's an escape. That's that's not fighting fire with water, which is how you succeed in fighting a fire. That's fighting fire with fire. That's saying, the solution to the problems that I experience in my everyday life that come from the capitalist system are going to be solved individually by myself alone through the process of myself becoming a capitalist, of myself becoming an exploiter and an oppressor, a little different than those who participated as the agents of the system that led me to such a position of despair and such a critical position with regards to 9-to-5 jobs and wage slavery. So I think it's overall a positive, a semi positive step. Like a lot of these radical recuperators, there's always a rational kernel there that I think must be exploited, for a lack of a better term. There's a rational kernel that we can get and disarticulate from that worldview and rearticulate towards another one. We can tell people, well, what are the actual odds that if you attempt to become rich yourself, to find this freedom that only lies outside of the 9-to-5 job, what are the actual possibilities of you accomplishing something like that? Statistics come out every now and then that sometimes it's even more likely for you to win the lottery than to do that through just sheer hard work and effort and ingenuity. So, you sustain the critique. Yes, this is a miserable system that we exist in. We don't escape it by becoming the agents of the miserable system. We escape it by coming together and fighting. And look at the example of China. Look at the example of Cuba. Look at the example of the since overthrown but hopefully returning Soviet Union, of Vietnam, of Laos, etc. These are countries that, under even worse conditions than the ones that we are in, were able to band together, fight off against the exploiters, and create a society where the people are actually in power. That's the route that is actually the red pill route. That's the route that the Matrix will never allow you to see. The Matrix allows you to see Tate. The Matrix allows you to see all these other radical recuperators, the Zizeks, etc. The Matrix doesn't want you to see Lenin. The Matrix doesn't want you to see, the Midwestern Marx Institute. It doesn't want you to see people who are actually criticizing the system and approaching things from the Marxist point of view. Remember what Engels said. The dialectical materialist method, that means Marxist philosophy, is the sharpest tool and best working weapon that the proletariat has in its struggle for a new world. So if you actually want to be red pill, this is the analysis that you need. But I think it's a hop, skip, and a jump away. I don't know if that's the correct phrase. A hop, skip, and a jump away from where Tate is at, the critique of wage slavery, to an actual Marxist position. So overall, I think it's a positive phenomenon, but we have to go there, get the people that he has convinced about wage slavery, and rearticulate their understanding, disarticulate it from a Tatean, almost like libertarian-like worldview, and towards a communist, Marxist-Leninist worldview.